Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we got a new deck tech video. We're gonna talk about Sabine ECL. So I know this is not the most exciting deck to talk about because obviously there's plenty of new leaders, new cards. Why would I want to just dedicate a new videos just to talk about a deck that is just barely different from its previous iteration in Spark of Rebellion? Well, the reason is very simple. I believe Sabine ECL is one of the best, if not the best deck in the game right now. And the reason why I believe that is because the deck was already very powerful in Spark of Rebellion. It was very present in the meta, and it has gotten a lot stronger with this expansion. Obviously, all the top tier deck got a lot of upgrades. For example, Control got Snoke. It got a lot of control tool, especially in the yellow. So Boba Fett also got a lot of upgrades as well. But those upgrades for those top tier decks are, I would say, complementary. They allow to flesh out the deck. They allow to basically complement some of the weaknesses that the deck had. But they don't. But they're not the best card of that deck. Like for example, Boba Fett is at the end of the day, yeah, Boba Fett has gone some upgrade, but at the end of the day, the strongest card of the deck remains the same. It remains the good old fire spray, cunning, that kind of thing. In Sabine ECL, the difference with Sabine ECL is like not only this deck got tremendous upgrades, but those upgrades are the best card of that deck. Like Sabine just got the new card that this deck got are literally the best card in that deck now, which is absolutely incredible. So the jump in power level of the deck has been tremendous. And as I said, it was already a very competitive deck. So the card that he's getting is really pushing the deck to the next level. So I needed to show you this deck because you're gonna have to play against it if you're gonna be playing any tournaments. And I think if you understand what it does, you might have a better shot at countering it. So let's talk now about I might make a separate videos on how to counter it, but I might need a little bit more time to figure this out because honestly, at this very moment, I'm not entirely sure how you're supposed to counter this. It is just an incredibly powerful deck. So I'm just going to assume that you know the basics of Sabine CL if you play just even one competitive event on Star Wars Unlimited Spark of Rebellion. You know what this deck is all about. It's an aggressive deck based on Sabine, where we're going to be putting tons of pressure in the early stage of the game, and then we're going to finish the game with For a Cause I Believe in. So in this video, we're going to focus a little bit more on uh, what does the old card do in this new context, in this new meta that is progressively shaping up. And we also, of course, going to talk about the newest edition and the newest upgrades that the deck got. So I call this deck Sabine ECL and not Sabine Green, very simply because I think that, as you can see, the deck is playing very little green. It's mostly a red-white deck. And you would assume, well, why not just get rid of those couple of green-red cards to just replace them by the double red cards, which are very powerful? Well, there's two reasons for this. The first reason is because it would mean that you would have to give up on ECL, and the second reason is because most of those double red cards are not heroism, so they would actually make for a cause I believe in slightly worse. But the real reason is that ECL is just incredibly powerful in this deck. It is the best, most important piece. It is uh, this deck makes use of Energy Conversion Lab. It makes better use of ECL than any other deck that I've seen, especially with the new expansion. So, without further ado, let's get into the card by card analysis. So let's talk. Yeah, we'll talk about the matchup after. So, Specful Soldiers, a significant amount of there's still a significant amount of Sentinel units in the meta. So obviously, having a way to disable it for only one resources does not disturb for a cause. Triggers of Fighter for Freedom is still going to be important. So this is still there for that reason. Battlefield Marine, of course, still remains the best 2-drop in the game. So a good reason to play green and are going to be the turn 1 play on the ground. Alliance X-Wing might be a little bit surprising, but at the end of the day, we still need 2 drops that are Rebel in the deck because they get buffed by Wing Leader as well as Fleet Lieutenant. This deck is a little bit less dependent on Rebels than some of the Spark of Rebellion version of the deck. The reason is because we do not play Metal Ceremony anymore and we don't play General Dodonna anymore. So those things basically makes it so we only need wing leader rebels for wing leaders and lieutenants, so we are a little bit less dependent on rebels, but still having 2 drops rebel is very important for the deck, and also having some space threats is very important. So X-Wing, not necessarily the most powerful card in the deck, but obviously an important card for the balance of the deck even after Shadows of the Galaxy. Then we got obviously Sabine, the other great 2-drop in this set in the deck. Both Mandalorian and Spectre Mandalorian traits matters a little bit in this deck, as we're gonna see later. And we got, of course, our A-Wing. Not as good as it used to be because now there's a lot of 3/2s in space that they did not exist before, but still remains the best space unit we can play on turn 1. So as a complementary to drop, I've decided to go with Kitsu Onyo. So there's a couple of options and not slots, and it's not everybody agrees. The previous card that I've shown you, pretty much every Sabine Green is gonna agree on which one to play. But then you do need more than 12 2-drops in this deck, and the reason why you need more than 12 2-drop is because missing a 2-drop in Sabine is basically the equivalent of losing the game. So, of course, 12 2-drop gives you a very high chance of having a 2-drop on turn 1, but really I found out that really you need to have a little bit more than this to really have the consistency. And also having multiple 2-drop is not necessarily a bad thing because this gives you the options to kind of arena dodge. So just for that reason, people have a tendency to play just more than 12 2-drops, and 14 2-drop is the number that a lot of decks have settled on. And that means that there's 12 2-drop that pretty much everybody agrees on, and then the last one is a little bit more up in the air. I've decided to go with Kitsu Onyo for multiple reasons. So first of all, it is heroism and aggression, which is great. So it doesn't disturb for a cause I believe in, and it does trigger on Fighter for Freedom. It is Mandalorian, which is a little bit relevant in this deck, as we're gonna see later. It is Saboteur, which is an excellent keyword, excellent trait to have, keyword to have in an aggro deck. And the ability to defeat upgrade that costs 2 or less is also very good. Remove experience token, remove shields, and remove things like entrench, remove bounties. There's simply just a lot of things that Kitsu Onyo do. So I believe that Kitsu Onyo is probably going to be... So the main problem with Kitsu Onyo is that she's not Rebel. But as I said earlier, this deck does not rely on Rebel as much as the previous Spark of Rebellion version of Sabine. And for that reason, I found that the card was very good. Obviously, if you are going to be following up with a Fleet Lieutenant or a Wing Leader, do not open up with Kitsu Onyo, so there's that limitation here. But for the most part, the card is just incredible and is going to be very powerful in some specific matchup. As I said, since she's going to be a card that you're going to be playing a little bit rare, this card is going to be played a little bit less often than something like a Marine or a Sabine, which are systematically going to be your go-to turn 1 play. It's okay for the card to be a little bit more specialized, but what I love about this card is like in the matchup in which it's good, it's going to be very good. So my personal opinion is that on this complementary 2-drop, you should be going for something that maybe is a little bit more situational, but is really going to be very powerful in situation in which you be good, because it is your complementary 2-drop at the end of the day. It is not your core 2-drop, is what I'm trying to say. So this is what I've decided to do. So go something that maybe is a little bit more situational, but in the right situation is going to be incredibly powerful. Next card, another new card from Shadows of the Galaxy, and I don't think I need to introduce that card, even though it's still a fairly new card, but this card has been designed to fit exactly in this deck. It is everything you would ever want. It is aggression, heroism. It has very good stats, 3 for 5, and it is a rebel. So 3 to 5 stat line is a very important stat line because it makes it so it makes it very difficult for your opponent to deal with in the early stage of the game with only one card. He's gonna most likely gonna have to use multiple cards to kill it, and this card will have to attack the base multiple times. And obviously icing on the cake is like it can smuggle, and you can play it for 5, and when it comes into 5, it comes into play ready, making the card incredibly slippery and difficult to deal with. Just a very, very good card and a very big upgrade for the deck because not only it gives you a little bit more reach, it also gives you a little bit more resiliency because if you run out of the card, you can always use this card as smuggle to kind of take over the game. So it's really just an amazing, a very, very solid card. But it is not even close to be the best card that has been added by Shadow of the Galaxy. Moving on, we got Fighter for Freedom. I think Fighter for Freedom got considerably better in this new set. There's a lot of shielded unit in the early stages of the game. It's the 3/4 stat line is very good to deal with all the 3/3 for 2s that are roaming around the meta. So I think I already thought that Fighter for Freedom was a most include in Sabine before, and now I believe it is even better than it used to be. Wing Leader, of course, the opening turn 1 Rebel Wing Leader turn 2 it's a combo that is as old as the starter set of the game where at the very beginning when people were playing, and it still is very good now. It's a combination that hasn't aged at all. It's very powerful, and there's less and less people who are playing False Choke. False Choke is really starting to see less play, so that means there's fewer and fewer answers to this 5/5 turn 2 play that can attack and be incredibly disruptive. So the Wing Leader is more than ever still very relevant. Fleet Lieutenant, basically it is Wing Leader, but I would say better in most cases because you get this immediate impact, your opponent cannot really deal with it, and you leave a 3/3 behind. Still very powerful, still a must-have in this deck. And we obviously play 12 2-drop that are rebels, so very consistent to get this out. K2SO remains of course one of the best cards in the deck. Very good with ECL as well, even though we will most of the time prefer to keep ECL for bigger targets. But yeah, K2SO is a very, very good card, obviously still today. Which leads me to my next point, of course, is Poe Dameron. So Poe Dameron has been labeled by many the best card in the set. And I'm starting to agree with this slowly. I thought Krayt Dragon was gonna have. I rated Krayt Dragon over, even those two cards are very different from one another. But I believe Poe Dameron is, in my opinion, the biggest upgrade to this deck. It's just absolutely insane with ECL. So before, in Spark of Rebellion, we had to play the Steadfast Battalion, and Steadfast Battalion had multiple inconvenience. First of all, you needed to really benefit from the +2/+2 and really one-shot an enemy leader. You needed to have Sabine in play, and the problem is Sabine is so fragile. She will get killed before Battalion comes into play. And the problem is like once the ECL is gone, then Battalion just becomes a 5/5 for 5 overwhelm, not very really much a threat. And on top of this, it was a card that was disturbing your 4 cause, I believe in. Poe Dameron, it is aggression and heroism, meaning it triggers on Fighter for Freedom. So yeah, another thing that I wanted to say about Fighter for Freedom is like we do play more red cards than we used to, which also makes it so Fighter for Freedom triggers more often. Anyway, going back to Poe, Poe is everything you want it to be. It's an insanely big stats. It's still a very valid play just to play it without ECL, but of course with ECL it can one-shot anything in the game. Just 8 damage right at the gate. The fact that you can deal those damage to the base is incredibly relevant. So you're almost always going to discard at least a card when you attack with Poe to deal 2 damage to the base. That is just almost by default the thing what you do. And then the defeat and upgrades are discarded in a card is something that you might or may not want to do. But something you have to say is that defeat and upgrade can be super relevant. It gives you a main deck answer to Traitorous, and the discarded card can be useful if your opponent is really short on card. When you have 1 card left, you want to discard that card. It can be very useful. But I would just say that 90% of the case, it's completely okay to just discard one card with Podamron. Be careful to not completely run out of gas because this deck has no way to draw cards. And one of the reasons why I don't play a lot of cheap units, like very cheap cards like Metal Ceremony, for example, that I used to play in this deck, I don't play it anymore. And the reason is mostly because I do not want to run out of card before Poe comes into play. And Poe does need to have a couple of spare cards to be able to run. So that's the reason why I have tendency to go away from playing too many very cheap cards because I want to have a certain amount of cards in hand as I'm putting Poe down. Basically, make sure you have at least one card to discard as Poe comes out. And once again, played with ECL or played without ECL, it really depends on the situation. But the card is not only gonna deal whatever is in front of it, it's also gonna put a humongous threat on the board, something that if it slaps the opponent will most likely win you the game. And 6 health, incredibly difficult to kill for a lot of decks. So this card is a massive, massive upgrade to Sabine. It basically makes Sabine win games that he normally should not be able to win. Like in Spark of Rebellion, there's a situation where once your opponent stabilizes in the mid portion of the game, there's just simply nothing you could do. Um, Basically, Sabine got himself a lot of mid-range option that completely fixes that problem. Anyway, I'll go into further details later on, but let's say Podamron is, in my opinion, the best card in the deck now, and it is an incredible upgrade for Sabine Green, and my biggest argument in saying that the deck has gotten so much better. But the next argument is also pretty sizable. It is obviously a Wrecker. Wrecker does cost one more resources, which is significant, but oh boy, when it hits the battlefield, it is so insanely impactful. Comes into play, defeating a resource is not really that big of a deal because Wrecker is going to be the most expensive card of the deck. Killing something or even just reducing a unit to a very low health, so then you can ambush with Wrecker, finish that unit off, and deal a tremendous amount of overwhelm damage to the base. That is just incredible. Or your opponent just simply goes like Boba unit and then Boba leader. You can just ambush, snipe the Boba unit, and overwhelm the Boba leader, and it's just and keep your Wreckers on the board. This is one of the key thing about this is like this guy can basically ambush a Vader and kill that Vader in one shot and stay alive. That is just so gross. This card is just incredible. It just swings the game completely in your favor as it comes out. If obviously even without ECL the card remains incredibly powerful, provides you with a huge threat on the board as well as killing a unit as it comes out. Absolutely incredible card and another massive upgrade for the deck. Does not aggression, heroism, everything you need. The fact that it's not a rebel for either Poe or Wrecker is not really that big of a deal because usually those units are not going to come into play are going to come into play in the initial portion of the game. And at this moment of the game, really the fleet lieutenants and the wing leaders are not really the kind of card that you're looking for. And also wing leader and fleet lieutenants are better on cards that are smaller stats because the +2/+2 upgrade does really make a big difference on those. While here, this card is already among us. It doesn't need two +1/+1 counters to be better. Talking about now about the non-unit cards, so we still play Heroic Sacrifice because still incredible with K2SO, and obviously still is a way for us to finish out games. The fact that you can basically play it without using the +2 attack bonus just to cycle it and draw a card is very relevant. And it is obviously aggression and heroism. This card is really still really good. We play 2 copies of this. Then we also play 2 copies of Rebel Assault, so we do play fewer Rebels than before, and Rebel Assault has gotten significantly worse compared to what it used to be because of the fact that, as I said, now we play a few non-Rebel cards. With that being said, it's still, I think, a card that is going to be very powerful in the mirror match, where we're going to be kind of swinging at each other. So I play 2 copies of Rebel Assault just simply to help in the mirror match because it's an amazing racing card. Next we got For a Cause I Believe In, of course, is our finisher. I personally don't believe For a Cause I Believe In is as important as it was in the previous iteration of the deck because we now have those massive top ender which are really good at finishing games, even though But obviously, there's always going to be a situation where your opponent is able to stabilize regardless, or a situation where you simply don't draw those big top enders. And Thorrk, I believe in, remains obviously the best finisher for the deck. It is even better now than it used to be because we are playing almost exclusively heroism card. In the main deck, we play only one card that is not heroism, which means that Thorrk, I believe in, is almost guaranteed to deal 4 damage, which is very, very good. Next, we got a new card, which is Heroic Resolve, and this card is, in my opinion, just a very solid. It does come into play, gives a +1/+1 to your unit, can be used either attached to your space unit or to ground units. It's very cheap. It's trigger fighter for freedom. Doesn't disturb for a cause I believe in. The +1/+1 for 1 is already kind of good, to be honest. Just play this on a strategic unit to make it out of range of something like a takedown or even out of range of a vigilance is just absolutely super relevant. And the ability to get +4 attack and overwhelm as you pay 2 is incredibly powerful finisher that I highly advise you to use. This card is simply very solid as a cheap kind of buff spell. It's simply just incredible. So me, I love this card, and I think it is and the fact that you can, yeah, no, it's just an incredibly powerful card. So I play 2 copies of Heroic Resolve. Moving on, we got 1 copy of the Dark Saber. So the Dark Saber has been one of the cards that people have discussed the most about because it is a difficult card to evaluate, as in some games it is absolutely game breaking and just single-handedly win you the game. And in some other games, it is just a card in your hand that you really don't want to play, that sticks in your hand like a sore thumb. And so it is a difficult one to rate because it has those wild variations. So in my version, I've decided to run 1 copy of the Darksaber because I acknowledge the power of the card, but I think it is situational. So you do not want to run more than that because, as I said, you do not want to be running into those situations. So why am I saying that this card is situational? First of all, it can only be equipped to non-vehicle units, so you need to have a non-vehicle unit on the board. You need to be playing against a deck that you know is not going to have an easy answer to the Darksaber, and there's a lot of decks that will have answers to it, like either it's going to be an upgrade removal, or it's going to be just simply playing as something as simple as just playing a Sentinel. You play this Darksaber, your opponent plays a Sentinel, and suddenly all the momentum that you get is lost. Um, and obviously the removal, like obviously Rivals Fall and that kind of thing. So obviously the main way you want to use that card is as you deploy Sabine, you're going to be playing Darksaber on Sabine. Obviously upgrades on leaders are a lot more difficult to deal with than upgrades on units. And then on attack, you're going to be able to give some experience token to your Mandalorian unit. We only played 2 Mandalorian units in the deck. We play Kitsu Onyo and Sabine. In the sideboard, we also play the Fang Fighters, which are also Mandalorian. So really, the +1 attack bonus is really not that big of a deal. However, it does allow you to the +4/+3, however, is very relevant. Obviously, if your opponent does not have an answer, and suddenly there's an invincible Sabine that just swings for 7 every time it attacks and has like 8 health, then suddenly this is just like a tremendous problem. So as I said, it's one of these cards. It's gonna be very powerful and it's gonna win you games. And the fact that, once again, just having 1 of them in your deck and the fact that your opponent has to respect the fact that you have that option is on by itself a very strong thing. But I do not advise to run more than 3. Even in the mirror match, the opponent can play a Poe, discard the Darksaber. Like, there's just a lot of bad things that can happen. So uh, it's a good card, but be very careful, be very aware of what the opponent answers are, and be very smart on the timing in which you play that card. Yeah, so this brings us to the sideboard. So this is basically it for the main deck. As you can see here, well, so what's the main difference between the Sabine before and now? Well, the big difference is the late game. Before, we were really reliant on the 4 cause I believe in to finish a game. Now we can basically stabilize the board and put a massive threat on the board at the same time in the mid portion of the game by combining Energy Conversion Lab with a Podamron or a Wrecker. And this is extremely consistent because we do play 6 of those cards, so by the time we reach turn 4 or turn 5, we're very likely to find either a Wrecker or a Podamron. Very rarely are you going to find a game where you don't find either of those cards. So it also changes the way we play ECL. In Before, you were kind of playing ECLs at different moments in the game, and one of the best targets for ECL would either be Steadfast Battalion, K2SO, but you could play ECL at different portions of the game. Now, I mean, obviously there's going to be a situation where you're going to be using ECL earlier, but in the vast majority of the case, you're going to be keeping ECL because you know that you're very consistently going to be able to find either Podamron or Wrecker. And the difference that it makes is like it makes it so the deck is much more capable of recovering from a bad start. So if you had a bad start with this deck, you no longer have to just pray that you're drawing 3 copies of 4 cards I believe in and just steal the game thanks to that. All you can do is just simply just get yourself an ECL Wrecker or ECL Podamron and completely swing the game back in your favor. It makes it so the deck is much more capable of fighting mid-range decks. Like this Podamron Wrecker combination is specifically powerful against mid-range deck, and mid-range decks have been historically the main weakness of Sabine. So I would say the Boba decks really pull Wrecker helps tremendously. So now that we talked about the main deck, let's talk about the sideboard a little bit. As I said, we're still kind of too early to really have a proper meta. So the sideboard plan, I do not have a sideboard plan, but I do have, of course, reason to play those sideboard cards. So we're gonna go them after one by one. So first of all, we got an additional copies of Rebel Assault for mostly the aggro mirror, or simply decks that are trying to race us but are not really trying to kill our units. Rebel Assault is going to be a great card in those matchups, so we play a third copy of it. Next we got Wolf, that is mostly against a deck that likes to stabilize against us by winning life, healing the base. And something I have to say is that I would say that healing is not as valuable against us that it used to be, because now we have this option of slapping units with a lot of stats on the board with Wrecker and Poe. But still, healing can be a problem, so Wolf does help with that. It's an excellent card to pick up from U-Wing Reinforcement, as we'll talk about later. So this is why it's there. Next, we got Disabling Fang Fighters, of course, as a way to remove enemy upgrades. Upgrades are significantly more powerful in Shadows of the Galaxy than they used to be. So Disabling Fang Fighters help with it. We got, like, of course, the Frozen in Carbonites. We got a lot of units with shield, a lot of units with experience, and we got also, of course, a Dark Saber. We can deal with this with the Disabling Fang Fighters. It is not a rebel, non-heroism, so I decided to not include it in the main deck for now. Next, we got a card that might surprise some of you. I gotta give a credit to Rebel Resource. So check out, he has his own YouTube channel where he's a very big Sabine Yellow player. And he included Valiant Assault Ship in his deck, and I think this is a genius idea because Valiant Assault Ship is very, very powerful in space. So basically, for people who don't know what it does, it's a 3/4 for 4 aerism aggression. It has Saboteur, and on attack, if the defending control more resource than it gets +2 attack. So it basically gets rated 2, sort of, whenever if your opponent has more resource than you. The way you want to use that card is, so first of all, against any ramp deck, this card is going to be a 5/4 for 4 Saboteur. And that is incredible. It's like, it's a lot of pressure for the opponent to deal with. And there's just not that many answers to it. So for example, Falcon, TIE Interceptors, Azeroth Gunship, like the 3/4 ambush, most of them only deal 3 damage. So 4 damage does make your units a lot more survivable. And not only that, if your opponent cannot block it either because it has Saboteur. So basically, most space units simply cannot kill it. And second of all, most sentinels in space obviously cannot kill it either. This makes this card just very difficult to deal with. Obviously, most blue decks will simply be able to use removal or this dice to open fire as well. So, and it doesn't have an immediate impact on the game. And obviously, a 4-drop that doesn't have an immediate impact on the game, and just simply just gets killed, is a big issue. Like Sabine doesn't like to play cards that don't have an immediate impact, and even K2SO, for example, does something when it dies. Valiant Astroships doesn't. So there's certain decks in which decks that have a lot of removal that are capable of killing that kind of units. Obviously, Valiant Astroships is not going to be ghost against them. And also, the stats are a little bit weak if you are playing against someone who's going to have the same amount of resources. So you can decide to not ramp yourself just in order to get the bonus anyway. But the problem with this is that it makes you further away from getting your Podamron and your Podamron and your Wreckers. So this is kind of a problem. Wrecker can defeat its own unit in order to give the bonus to Valiant Assault Ship. So this is kind of thing to consider. So against who do you want to side this card? So first of all, anything that ramps. So any Han deck, any Vader deck, or like the ramp Bosk deck. All those decks, you're gonna like having this card because he's gonna get this +2 bonus without any effort on your part most of the time. And I think the card is very good against people who don't have a lot of answers against space units, and the few answers that they have are most likely going to be like ambushing unit or unit that have sentinel. And obviously, Valiant Associate basically just doesn't care about any of those. So this card is very strong against Han, for example, because Han most likely will try to stabilize the Space Arena with a Bright Hope or with a Millennium Falcon. So if you play this card, then the only answer that he has is going to be a Marauder. So yeah, but he needs to find it, right? So Valiant Starship, I think, is just uh, a sneaky good card against a lot of decks, and obviously the 5 attack is just tremendous amount of pressure for the opponent. So yeah, kudos to Rebel Resources to really discover this card because definitely I would not have thought about this card if he didn't show me with his performance during the Take the Initiative tournament. Moving on, we obviously got U-Wing Reinforcement. So U-Wing Reinforcement is going to be a great sideboard card against any control, mid-range control, grindy decks that have these capabilities of delaying the game significantly, and U-Wing Reinforcement is going to act as an additional late game card that can really pull us back into the game. So it kind of fulfill a similar role as Wrecker and Poe, as it allows us to kind of give ourselves a huge boost of power whenever the opponent has managed to stabilize. So it's a little bit more expensive and a little bit more extreme than Wrecker and Poe, but it performs kind of the same role. It also can act as a finisher if you only have just one rebel unit, as long as you got one ready rebel unit on the battlefield. As you play U-Wing Reinforcement, then suddenly U-Wing Reinforcement can be turned into a super powerful finisher because you can find a wing leader and a fleet lieutenant, sometimes even both, and you can just get a massive swing on the opponent, and these swings can sometimes win you the game. I've been able to steal games where I got just a rebel in play and just U-Wing Reinforcement, give 2+1/+1 count on that unit, then attack that unit for 6 or 7 and finish the game like that. So there's stuff you can do. You can also do it with Fighter for Freedom. So you play Fighter for Freedom and you find 2 red units alongside it, which is really not that difficult to do. And then you basically put 3 threat on the board and you deal 2 damage to the base. It is an excellent, excellent way to finish the game. We obviously have Cassian Andor, which is also a finisher, but U-Wing Reinforcement is really kind of a great card in this deck. If you are playing some of your sideboard cards, it also will give you an easier time finding those sideboard cards. You know, for example, your opponent is almost dead, but he's playing a blue control deck. You know that Vigilance is likely to heal him up. You started the game, you start a turn playing U-Wing Reinforcement, you get a Wolf, yeah, no healing for that turn, and then suddenly you can win the game. It also gives you easier time finding your Fang Fighters to get rid of an upgrade. Obviously, you can still find your Wreckers and your Poe and put some unit alongside it to put some more pressure. This card is just incredible in this deck. So, but it needs to be. So the reason why we don't play it in the main deck, because against most decks, usually games finishes before we get to Ewing Reinforcement, especially with Wrecker, which will deramp us. Um, but I would say against any grindy matchup, Ewing Reinforcement is an absolute must-have, in my opinion. Okay, so we're gonna do a couple of mulligan. I mean, to kind of see how the deck flows. But obviously, if you played Sabine, I'm not gonna do too many of them because it's very self-explanatory. Okay, this one is not bad. We got a turn 1, a turn 2, a turn 3, and we're going full on in space. It's the kind of hand that is not the best hand. Usually, you want to have a 1-drop, a 2-drop in space, and a 2-drop on the ground, so then you can arena dodge the opponent. But I wouldn't mulligan a hand like this and take the risk of getting a hand that is a lot worse. Or taking the risk of a hand that doesn't have any 2-drop at all. And this hand has a pretty smooth curve. It's going all in space, which I think can be very powerful against some matchups. And it has, yeah, turn 1 X-Wing, turn 2 Red 3, turn 4, turn 1 X-Wing, turn 2 Red 3, turn 4, turn 3 K2SO, turn 4 Po is a very powerful curve. Probably, if I'm in a mirror match, I might as well, I might keep the Rebel Assault if I'm against another aggro deck. I'm probably going to resolve the Heroic Resolve and the Rebel Assault, unless I'm playing as aggro, in which case I might resource something else. Okay, this one is decent. Once again, we got a turn 1 Sabine, turn 1 Marine. On turn 2, we would prefer to have a Fleet Lieutenant and a Wing Leader. But once again, I don't think this hand is bad enough that you would want to mulligan it. Because obviously, every time you mulligan a hand that is perfectly playable, you're taking the risk of getting a hand that doesn't have any 2-drops at all, which is just terrible for the deck. And it can happen, even though we're playing 14 2-drops, it can happen. I would probably resolve the Fighter for Freedom and the Sabine, go turn 1 Marine, turn 2 Fighter for Freedom. Try to keep the 4 cards I believe in the Poe as much as possible, since those cards are some of the best cards in your deck, but you're gonna have to draw some action after that, but that's okay, we have 2 turns to do so. Okay, okay, this hand is really bad. Yes, it does have a turn 1 play, but then we don't have any turn 2. Because we don't have any 3-drops, so if we don't find a turn 2 play, our game is pretty much over. So, and its turn 1 play is not even that impressive to begin with, so I would definitely mulligan this hand. Okay, well, this is something that can happen in this deck. Sometimes you don't find a turn 1 play, and this is terrible. And this is the reason why even though your hand is not perfect, if you do have a smooth curve, it's a perfectly acceptable hand. So here, obviously, if we mulligan into this, that would be pretty bad news and pretty unlucky. But as I said, I think this deck, more than the Spark of Rebellion version of that deck, is much more capable of recovering from a very bad start. And obviously here we can go turn 2 Rebel 3, then Fleet Lieutenant, all K2SO depending if Rebel 3 has been dealt with or not, and then go Poe, and it still can slap very hard. Um, Damn, we're having difficulties finding good hands here. I'm being very unlucky on those mulligans. Because, as I said, I remind people, we're playing 14 2-drops. So once again, this would be a mulligan. And a new hand. Okay, there's finally a good hand. This hand is excellent because obviously we would probably open up with A-Wing because we want the A-Wing to be supported by Wing Leader or Fleet Lieutenant. Usually we want to have another 3-drop that is not a Wing Leader or Fleet Lieutenant. So then if the unit on turn 1 gets dealt with, we have the alternative to play something that does not rely on having a rebel unit on the board. But if your opponent does not play with our 2-drop, this is almost the best start you could possibly have. So we're either going to go A-Wing into Wing Leader or A-Wing into Fleet Lieutenant, depending on the matchup. Probably resource Kitsu Onyo and a Wrecker. It's a bit too early to draw a Wrecker. Or you could even resource the Wrecker and Heroic Sacrifice, so then if the A-Wing gets dealt with, we can play Kitsu Onyo. It's not great because it's not a rebel, but in this case, obviously, we're going to be hoping to find a 2-drop that, like a follow-up play. If our I-Wing gets there, we're going to be hoping to draw a follow-up play that is a rebel. But to be honest, it's very likely to be the case because we do play quite a few in the deck. Okay, this hand is really good. We can go, I mean, it's not amazing, but yeah, we're going to open a Marine, follow-up Fighter for Freedom, resource those 2 cards, keep Heroic Resolve for cards I believe in. I haven't drawn any amazing hand here. Usually, basically, the ideal hand for this deck is going to be a space unit and a ground unit, a 2-drop, so we can arena dodge. We can either go space or ground depending on where your opponent goes. Then a follow-up wing leader or fleet lieutenant. And in case that first 2-drop got scaled, an alternative as like something like a Cassian or Red 3 or a Fighter for Freedom as a way to recover if that unit gets dealt with. So now let's talk about the card that I've decided to not include into this deck. So Metal Ceremony is one of those cards. So multiple reasons why Metal Ceremony is not making the cut in this deck. The first reason is because basically one of the strongest things to do with Metal Ceremony was basically you would use the Metal Ceremony on the flip turn of Sabine. You would be attacking with 2 units. You would try to have 2 units before Sabine comes out. Sabine comes out. So then you have 3 rebel units that have attacked this turn. And then you would use ECL to put a 4th unit on the battlefield. Usually it's going to be a K2 SO. And then even if one of those units get dealt with, you can play Metal Ceremony and you're getting on 3 rebels. And you can do this relatively consistently. There's multiple things that have changed. The first thing is that, first of all, Metal Ceremony is card disadvantage. And whenever you have a hand with Metal Ceremony, it has a tendency to make it so you're running with very few cards in hand after you play Metal Ceremony. And as I said earlier, in order to make our Podam run strong, we need to have a couple of spare cards to discard. And whenever you're playing Metal Ceremony, it's a lot more difficult to do that. The second reason why we don't play Metal Ceremony, we play fewer rebels than we used to. As I said, okay, so Onyo, the top enders are also not rebels. So Metal Ceremony makes it a little bit less consistent. And the third reason is that we do not use ECL as early as we used to. Before, we would use ECL on K2SO fairly often. Nowadays, we do not use ECL as often. We use ECL on Poe and Wrecker as a priority. And in which case, Metal Ceremony doesn't really work with that because those cards are not rebels. So basically, Metal Ceremony is just a slightly... It was already not an auto-include, in my opinion, in the previous iteration of the deck, but now it has just became a lot less consistent and also doesn't work very well with the new tools that we have. Daring Raid is another very good card that you can include. The reason that I went against it is that, yes, 2 damage, first of all, is not good against everything. There's certain decks that simply do not care about you being able to deal 2 damage to them. So unless you can combine this with a Thorrk in town, then Daring Raid becomes very low impact. The second problem is that obviously the card is not heroism. Which means that it disturbs the 4 cards I believe in. So obviously it's a card that can deal 2 damage to the base, 2 direct damage to the base. That's very strong. But I think those 2 reasons combined, and obviously the third reason is once again what I was saying about Podamron earlier, is that you do not want to run too many cheap low value cards because otherwise you take the risk of running out of cards and not being able to use your Poe properly. So those basically 3 reasons that makes it so Daring Raid did not make the cut in this deck, even though it is undeniably a great aggro card. And I'm assuming, for example, double mono red version of Sabine might actually want to play that. Rebel Pathfinder, believe it or not, is still a strong consideration for a 2-drop in this deck. So basically, I think if you want to have something a bit more situational but more powerful, you go for Kitsu Onyo. If you want to go for the stability and the consistency, you want to go Rebel Pathfinder or Y-Wing, because both of those units are rebels, 2-drop rebels, so it makes the deck more consistent with Wing Leaders and Fleet Lieutenant. So it's kind of a choice, consistency or power. Personally, I've decided to go for power because we already had 12 Rebel. But if you want to go a bit more consistent, you might want to go Rebel Pathfinder. An R2D2 is another consideration as some sort of like curve filler where you can play this and run it alongside another 2-drop to add more pressure on the opponent, a unit that is difficult to get rid of and is also a rebel. So it is something that has been strongly considered that has seen some play before for that reason. The reason why I don't want R2D2 is the same reason as Metal Ceremony, Daring Raid, is like, once again, if you're running too many cheap units, you run out of cards very quickly, makes a Podam run more difficult to use. So personally, I went away from R2D2 for that reason. So Reckless Gunslinger doesn't have that same issue because it can be smuggled. The reason why I didn't run him is because I don't think it is a non-heroism card, and in my opinion, the card is not strong enough to justify being played in to disturb the four cause I believe in. That's kind of like my thought process here. It's also not rebel. It's like yeah, it has a lot of issues, but in other aggro decks, it's definitely a very strong card. And the fact that it's like a natural threat that deals direct damage to the base that can be smuggled, that's very high value. Okay, another very strong consideration is timely intervention. Obviously, as you know, ECL is absolutely key in this deck. It's insanely powerful. Um, but the problem is, at the end of the day, Sabine ECL is going to be a deck that's going to be winning games extremely quickly. And the problem is having to pay an extra resources on top of the cost of the unit usually delays that play too much for this to be useful. So basically, if you want to use this on a wrecker, you're gonna have to wait for a minimum until turn 6. You're gonna have to delay um, your your um, your wrecker by one turn. If you want to play this on the Poe, once again you have to delay your Poe by one turn. In a deck like this, in a deck like Sabine, having to do that is a massive, massive cost. The other problem is what I was talking about earlier with Poe is the card disadvantage, which makes it more difficult. If you're using timely intervention as a regular card, not smuggled, on Poe, most likely you're not going to have a lot of cards to discard from Poe at that point because you're doing card disadvantage with timely intervention. So once again, you have to be aware of that. Obviously, you can fix that problem by using it as a smuggle, but then you have to delay your Poe even more. So I just found the card very difficult to use for that reason. In a deck like this where you want to finish games super quickly, timely intervention is simply just a little bit too slow, unfortunately. Of course, there's still a situation in which it's very good, and of course, do not forget that it's a card that at the end of the day, into your top deck mode, it's not a card that you want to see. It's also a card that is not heroism disturb your four cards I believe in. So there's just a lot of downside for this card. So I ended up just deciding not to use it. Basically, games usually don't go long enough for this card to be any relevant. Then we got the Grey Squadron's Y-Wing. I used to think very lowly of this card, and I've been relatively not impressed, but I would say, okay, this card has a role to fill in this deck, as basically, if you want to go for a safe option, a safe 2 drops to go for, that's going to work with Fleet Lieutenants and Wing Leader, Y-Wing is going to be a decent option in space. So it's either kind of like if you want to play it safe on your complementary 2 drops, you either want to go Rebel Pathfinder of Y-Wing, and which one is better depends on your experience. Y-Wing is a little bit more inconsistent because there's going to be a situation where your opponent really doesn't care about the 2 damage and is always going to choose a unit to take the damage and is not really going to care about it, and it's just going to be a 1-3 for 2, which is pretty terrible. There's going to be a situation where it's going to be a 3-3 for 2, and that's going to be amazing. So it's a little bit inconsistent, and it's consistent in the sense that it's a rebel unit, so it's great for once again your Y-wing and your X-wings. But it is bad in this. It is inconsistent in the sense that it highly depends on what your opponent is playing. So personally, I'm not a big fan of Grey Squadron Y-wing. Even if I wanted to play a complementary draw, I would rather play Pathfinder. But it is definitely a consideration as you complement 2 drop if, once again, you want to stick to the Rebel. If you do not want to stick to Rebel, obviously Kitsuonyo is going to be a stronger option. Inspiring Mentor is another card that I've seen roaming around. I don't hate the card, but it has multiple problems. The problem is, of course, it's an attachment that does not cannot be equipped to vehicles. That's a big problem because there's going to be a lot of situations where you don't have vehicles into play. It is relatively expensive, and it comes you're guaranteed to get an experience out of it if you play that unit, and then you can give an experience to another friendly unit, but you also have to have 2 units side by side for this to actually work. In my opinion, there's just so many conditions attached to this card, I would rather play something that is cheaper and less conditional, which is Heroic Resolve. In my opinion, a far better card. Mercenary Gunship, if you want to go for more aggressive 2-drop that is not Rebel, Mercer gunship in space can be a consideration. Keep in mind that obviously it is not an heroism card, so will disturb your forecast, I believe in. So not sure the card is strong enough to justify that. And the opponent being able to take control of it is a significant downside, in my opinion. So as much as I like this card, I think this card is at its best in a more defensive deck as a way to counter the A-Wings, a way to counter your space unit, and in a way you want to trade with that unit very early on, so then it dies to an opponent unit, and then you don't get to suffer from the downside of the action. But in an aggro deck, you're not really going to try to trade, you're going to try to attack the opponent base, in which case this unit is still going to be around later on in the game, which means that the downside is going to be turned against you. A card that used to be an auto-include in Sabine Green and now is definitely falling on the wayside is Echo Base Defender. Yes, it has a lot of stats and the Sentinel can be very relevant, especially in a mirror match, but the 3 health is really a big problem. There's just so many units to drop now that have 3 health in order to fight Sabine, in order to fight Battlefield Marine, that obviously people no longer... so this card is very often just going to trade with a 2 drop. Certain decks just need that early Sentinel units, but I don't think Sabine is one of those decks. So as a result, there's just better things to do. There's just better 3 drops that you can play in Sabine deck, so Echo Base Defender no longer makes the cut. Southern Peacekeeper is very good and I think a strong consideration for the sideboard. It has a couple of weaknesses. It is not a rebel. And the Restore 2 in some matchup is pretty irrelevant, and the fact that it only has 1 attack means that when an opponent is going to be attacking, the Southern Peacekeeper is not going to lose units as a result. So those problems makes the Peacekeeper a little bit bad. I think it's a consideration in the sideboard for the Mirror of Aggro, but that's about it. Another strong consideration for the Mirror of Aggro, and also a card that can be quite good against Boba, is obviously Bright Hope. Was a way to block the space arena completely. Decided to go against it as well. I wanted to go for more aggressive, but maybe as the meta evolve, if Bright Hope is well positioned in that meta, it might come back into the deck either in the main deck or in the sideboard. Desperado Freighter is a card that is surprisingly powerful. In aggro, it is kind of like a fire spray because, okay, it doesn't come into play ready, but it does come into play 1 turn earlier and has the same stat as a fire spray, so it kind of offers the same role as this massive space menace that just put tremendous amount of pressure on the opponent. I like it. I just find if we're going to be fighting against, try to deal with decks that have relatively low space defense, I personally prefer to play Valiant Assault Ship instead of Desperado Freighter. So I think that if Valiant Assault Ship did not see play, I would probably give it a second thoughts. But for now, I think the Assault Ship also fits a little bit better in the curve because usually on turn 5 you want to be playing a Poe or later on a Wrecker. In that curve point, just Valiant fits a bit better in the curve, deals the same amount of damage in space, and also has Saboteur, so it's just a little bit better than Freighter. But this card is definitely better than I thought. Then final consideration is obviously the good classic Black One. Black One turns out to be a little bit too slow in most matchups to really be a good card, but now with the ability of Poe to discard your own cards, you can really end up with very few cards in hand, making Black One slightly better. I think if I had to play Black One, it would probably be a sideboard card against, once again, super grindy decks instead of playing U-Wing Reinforcement. But I personally find U-Wing Reinforcement to be far more impactful because it doesn't just only draw you a card, it also puts those cards on the ground, on the battlefield, while Black One just draws you those cards. So it is kind of the same kind of card as U-Wing to kind of give you like a second, it gives you a little bit of gas to finish the game against very grindy matchups. But I think U-Wing Reinforcement performed that job a lot better. So that's why I did not include it. And here you have, this is basically my version of Sabine ECL. In my opinion, it is one of the strongest deck in the game because it is, in my opinion, has excellent matchup against almost everything. Even against the quote-unquote bad matchup, it is it is definitely stronger than it used to be. So let's talk about the matchup a little bit. So first of all, let's talk about so the control matchup as is just a lot better than it used to. Because we got Cassian Endor that can be smuggled. We have Podamron and Wrecker, which are very powerful card against at least mid-range control. Against hard control, not as much, but against mid control, it's very powerful. Those cards are incredibly powerful. Our four cards, I believe, are more consistent. The Ewing, we have excellent sideboard option against control. Um, Against mid-range, so especially against Boba, the matchup has gotten a lot. Podamron and Wrecker have made the matchup so much better against those mid-range decks. And and it still, in my opinion, is going to be the best aggro deck available. So it just is just a very well-rounded deck, and I honestly don't see any deck that can really challenge it. Basically, in Spark of Rebellion, there were two decks that were very good against Sabine, mostly the Krennic mid-range deck, and the Boba decks. And in my opinion, Poe and Wreckers have effectively fixed those matchups. They basically make those matchups so much. The fact that you have now so many options to one-shot Krennic with Poe and prevent that Krennic from healing over and over again is a huge, huge answer that we didn't have access to before. I mean, before we had to rely on Steadfast Battalion to one-shot a Krennic, but for this, your Sabine needed to stay alive. So all the Krennic deck had to do was to kill the Sabine and then deploy the Krennic afterward. And suddenly you got a Krennic that was just almost impossible to kill, that would just be gaining health every turn. This is no longer something that you can do because you can just simply ECL Poe, even if Sabine has been dealt with, and one-shot the Krennic. So it's just so incredibly difficult to play around. And once again, the Wrecker is incredibly powerful against Boba, as I said earlier. The ability to just one-shot the Boba and kill another unit alongside it is just incredible. So I just think the deck has just too many tools to deal with those mid-range deck, which was his main weakness. And that by itself makes me so if I had to run a tournament tomorrow, and if my bet was the strongest deck in the game, I would say Sabine ECL is the one. Right now we have the Tech Initiative tournaments where currently You Can Call Me Al is in the semi-final playing Sabine ECL. So he still has two games to play, but I think he's the grand favorite to win this tournament. To win this tournament. So we'll see how things go, but I think he's the grand favorite to win this tournament. And if the Sabine ECL wins the TTI, it would be I would say a confirmation, but at least an additional insight in how powerful this deck is. So anyway, thank you very much for following that video, and I hope this was informative. I know it's not the most out of the box thinking deck, but I think I needed to show you because you need to know that this deck exists because it's going to be everywhere in my opinion. And hope you have a good time. Please, if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and check out my coaching schedule if you're looking for personalized help for the game. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.